Hi guys, I want to take a minute to talk to you really seriously about an important issue, and that is how Brian works. You see, and this is a big deal, recently we exposed the fact that Brian lied about a seminar that he said he attended. In order to prove that he was at the seminar, Brian borrowed photos from a Ninja Master's website and altered those photos, claiming that they were rare old photographs that he was showing to prove his attendance, when in fact those photos were taken from the website. They weren't rare at all. They were online, and he altered them for his use. Brian has ignored the fact that we caught him in this lie. Repeatedly, he has just pretended it never happened. Brian has also done something that he does very commonly. When we pointed out that no public park in Canada would permit a martial arts study group to play around in the park after hours, Brian seized on some small piece of the discussion, specifically whether or not the Bokken is a harmless training tool, and kept making videos about that as if that somehow addressed the argument. Let's go back to the beginning and say, step by step, the problems with this. Brian has claimed to be a martial artist. Brian is not a martial artist. Brian has no talent whatsoever for the martial arts and no training. It shows very obviously in everything that Brian does. Or rather, it shows very obviously in everything that Brian doesn't. Brian never substantiates his claims. Brian never demonstrates any skill whatsoever. Brian never moves in a way that would make you think he has any martial arts training. And most importantly, every time Brian opens his mouth about the martial arts, he makes a fool of himself. His ignorance is obvious in every word coming out of his mouth. Brian has never said anything about the martial arts that was anything but almost wholly ignorant. The Bokken is no exception. Now, Brian has claimed to have a study group. He has claimed that that study group meets in the middle of the night in a public park with the permission of the local authorities. Every part of this story is impossible. No public park in Canada would permit people to train in the martial arts because of the insurance liabilities. When people come into the park and do things during the park's operating hours, the park has no specific control over that. The park does not grant their sanction to that activity. But were the park to grant permission to a study group to meet after hours, the park would be assuming liability for that, insurance liability. Therefore, no public park would do that. Secondly, no public park in Canada would permit people to be there in the middle of the night because all of these parks have very strict rules about who can be there after hours. And thirdly, the fact that Brian claims to be involved in a study group that, among other things, studies KENJUTSU is absurd. Brian knows nothing about the Japanese sword. Brian has no skills with the Japanese sword. And Brian repeatedly demonstrates his ignorance of the Japanese sword. Most recently, he keeps posting about how harmless the Bokken is, when in fact the Bokken is a weapon in its own right. The Kendo Shinai, the bamboo training sword used in Kendo, was created because the Bokken is dangerous enough that students will be injured when using it properly. Folks, we created this channel specifically to address the ridiculous claims of certain people in the martial arts world who constantly say that they are who they are not, and who always speak ignorantly about the martial arts. Brian is not a martial artist. Brian is an ignorant fool who doesn't understand the things he's talking about, who is desperate to claim to know more than he does. Brian has lied about seminars he said he attended. We have caught him in this lie, and what did he do? He ignored it. He did not address it. Brian has lied about his study group. He has claimed to be involved in a group that simply cannot exist as he has described it, for the reasons we have outlined. Brian has claimed to be trained in a variety of martial arts, when in fact, the things he says shows he is ignorant of those martial arts and that he could not be involved in them. We publicly challenge Brian to answer and address these issues, but he won't. We predict he will seize on some tiny part of this and pretend that that tiny part is important, and then argue that tiny point to death, which is what he's done with the Bokken. The fact is, Brian knows nothing about the martial arts, about Kenjutsu, about ninjutsu, and about training in self-defense. Brian is neither ninja nor martial artist. Brian is simply ignorant. Thank you for listening to this piece.